Hello, everyone. This is Robert Moyer, and this is my presentation on my research paper, Fossil Fuel Emissions and Human Influence Global Climate Change. So what I'm looking to argue is that we must significantly reduce our fossil fuel emissions as they are the primary cause of human influenced global warming. So when you look at the climate system, there are basically five components that interact with the solar radiation being emitted by the sun, which create an energy balanced climate system on the Earth. Greenhouse gases are a part of that. They do occur naturally in the atmosphere. The primary greenhouse gases we want to explore are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor. So fluctuations in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere occur naturally through things like volcanic eruptions and sunspots. But more importantly, and more prolonged influx of greenhouse gases has been the result of human activity, which is energy production, transportation, waste disposal, and agricultural processes. So when we look at the greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 is by far the one that is most responsible for accelerating global warming. And the reason for that is due to its extended presence in the atmosphere, which we'll touch on in a later slide. CO2 is naturally produced, so things like respiration of living organisms, fermentation by microbes, and burning of organic matter are a few ways that naturally produced CO2 emissions occur. But what we're really focused on is the anthropogenic or the human-caused production of these emissions, which is primarily the result of burning fossil fuels. Also, deforestation is a factor, and then to a much lesser extent, some industrial manufacturing processes. As I mentioned, the other greenhouse gases, methane, which is primarily agricultural processes, nitrous oxide, which results from farming practices and sewage treatment, and then water vapor, again, necessary, but what happens is as the climate warms, the water vapor in the atmosphere expands, which increases not only temperature, but also is a factor in extreme weather events, which we'll talk about later as well. So for my focus, the fossil fuels, the types that we're really concerned about, obviously, are oil, gas, and coal, um, primarily used for heat and energy for transportation. So these, the burning of these fossil fuels, as well as the extraction processes and the transportation of these fuels, leads directly to the production of emissions of CO2 and greenhouse gases in general. Land transformation, as I mentioned, is another factor. So deforestation basically eliminates a carbon sink. So a carbon sink is any process or mechanism that removes greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So in addition to forests and trees, we're also talking about plants and oceans, the atmosphere itself, and then soil. So as deforestation occurs, we lose a sink, which means that that carbon either remains in the atmosphere or is in another sink like the ocean. In both cases, creating other consequences. So 80% of the CO2 emissions come from burning fossil fuels, and the balance of about 20% comes from land transformation. So obviously, the big focus opportunity here is on the use of fossil fuels. In addition to the CO2, we also see particulate matter and sulfate aerosols being a consequence of the use of fossil fuels. So this particulate matter is potentially harmful to humans, especially children. It can lead to respiratory ailments. And then another consequence is the fact that it adds density to the atmosphere, which not only deflects incoming infrared rays from the sun, but also prevents the terrestrial radiation that is trying to be emitted by the Earth back into space from leaving the atmosphere, which again contributes to the warming cycle. Fossil fuel emissions continue to increase. As you can see from this chart, we've had a trend line here that's been nothing but up over the last century plus. So some of the things we could be considering as far as alternatives to fossil fuels would be to increase the access to and use of public and physically active means of transportation. We could also look to reduce energy use through conservation and the use of alternative forms of renewable energy. CO2 is a real factor, again, because it remains in the atmosphere for over 100 years. So the pipeline is already full, and that's why it's so important to stop feeding the atmosphere with these dangerous CO2 emissions. Over the last 100 years, we've seen the average temperature increase by 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Scientists predict that if we stayed on the current trend, by the end of the century, you could see increases of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. And as you can see from the quote, that would be detrimental. We've never seen anything like that, and scientists argue that such a future would likely be incompatible with human civilization. When you look at sort of the trend line over the last century plus, you can see where the temperature anomalies have occurred. And since about the late 1970s, the trend in both land and ocean has been upwards, and it has been fairly consistently upwards as well. And this just gives you kind of a snapshot from a decade over decade perspective. So you can kind of see that since, again, about the late 70s, we've seen some pretty big jumps in each decade, and that's anticipated to continue. A couple of things that we can do to address climate change. One would be mitigation. So we want to slow and stabilize the current trends. We want to reverse the human impact over time. Some approaches to mitigation would include the reduction or elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, which we'll talk about in a minute. Support government representatives and corporations that address emission reductions. Carbon tax has been floated as an idea, and also continuing to use renewable forms of energy. Individually, I think we can all make some changes in our household behaviors to have an impact. Burning fossil fuels contributes about 38% of the CO2 emissions result directly from things like the use of motor vehicles and space heating. So things that we can do to further minimize that would be very good for the climate. Talked a minute ago about fuel subsidies. So unfortunately, when you look at the G7 countries, we as a combined entity continue to contribute $100 billion a year supporting fossil fuels, the very thing that we know is contributing to climate change. We're continuing to subsidize some of these companies, primarily coal, for example, and the U.S. is unfortunately leading that charge at $26 billion a year. So another option to address climate change would be adaptation. So that can be basically to adjust to current and anticipated future consequences. So that could be things like investing in the infrastructure. It can be incremental or transformational, depending on what needs to happen and the anticipated impact to the specific area or region. One of the concerns with this strategy is that developing countries may not have A, the existing infrastructure, and B, certainly not the economies to make the investments that they need to prepare for the future. So definitely something that we need to address moving forward. So when we look at challenges to change, 170 nations as far back ago as 1992, during the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change, agreed that we needed to limit the use of fossil fuels and increase sustainability development of alternative forms of energy. However, you saw that the fossil fuel use has really not decreased in any kind of a major way. So more needs to be done there. In the U.S., people tend to view climate change as a significant global threat. However, many do not feel threatened by climate change, and many also don't know that they know how to mitigate change. So I think education is an opportunity there. Governments need to reevaluate economic and industrial policies. Some challenges here are basically due to the partisan, political, and ideological divides surrounding climate change. Denialist is certainly one of those areas where these folks believe that there is some uncertainty in the science that must be considered. Denialists typically are influenced by opposition to government regulation of business, and they're also typically defenders of individualism versus collectivism. So some consequences of inaction. So human health concerns is a big one, and I'll show you a wheel here on the next slide. relative to that, to agricultural and food security, fresh water supplies, damage to ecosystems. So as a result of climate change, we could see the extinction of many species of insects, plants, and animals, displaced populations, which we'll touch on, and then the potential of significant international conflicts due to the scarcity of resources. So when you look at human health, you can kind of see here from this wheel where some of that impact may be in the future. We just want to touch on a few major consequences, if you will. So sea level rise is certainly one. So as the ice caps and ice sheets in polar regions continue to melt as a result of the warming climate, we can stand to lose hundreds of coastal cities around the world. Obviously, devastating economic consequences to that, but also the hardship for millions of people who would need to be moved as they're displaced from these low-lying areas. Scientists believe that if the current rate of warming continues, we could see sea level rises on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of 5 feet by just the end of the century, and Pacific coast could see 3 feet rises as well. Another consequence would be the ocean damage, and specifically to the coral reef ecosystems. So as the ocean, again, being a sink, is absorbing more of the carbon emissions that are in the atmosphere, it's increasing water temperatures, which is impacting the pH balance in the ocean waters. This is leading to coral bleaching and eventually mass mortality to ocean coral, which would have devastating consequences to the coral reef ecosystems. And again, millions of people depend on these ecosystems for their livelihood in tropical coastal areas. This is just an overview of the threat to the coral reefs and where some of those threats come from. Another consequence would be climate extremes, and I think we've seen some evidence of this. Increased levels of moisture in the air as a result of this warmer temperatures is actually leading to heavier rains and increased flooding around the world. So in addition to that, we're also seeing these higher temperatures, which are extending droughts. So these extreme weather events will continue, and they will test the infrastructure of many of these countries. So access to roads, viability of bridges, power outages, fuel shortages, and so on. Another major threat is obviously to the food and freshwater security. So crop yields can be impacted by these droughts and flooding, and obviously the potential to contaminate the freshwater supplies. And then increased wildfire frequency. So droughts will dry out vegetation and soil, which creates fuel for wildfires, as we've unfortunately seen recently. And this is just a summary of the adverse impacts of water, ecosystems, food, coasts, and health. And one of the most, significant consequences from a social justice perspective is the impact on vulnerable populations. So with climate change, unfortunately, those that suffer first, and in many cases worst, will be those that had least to do with creating the situation. So the industrial countries have contributed 8 times more carbon emissions per capita than the developing countries have. And the US, unfortunately, has led with CO2 emissions. Adaptation appears to be inevitable, but one of the concerns is, as I mentioned, the fact that a lot of these developing countries do not have the financial resources or potentially the infrastructure to build upon. So it's really going to be up to the international community to assist with these investments. And then the final slide talks about our responsibility to the world and to our planet. So, I'm going to suggest that we must reduce our use of fossil fuels and the associated emissions through things like increasing awareness, exploring individual and household changes that we can make, and by demanding the government action at local and national levels to reduce our impact on this situation. We need to secure justice for the poor and marginalized whose rights and prospects have been impacted, again, as they've had little to do with creating the problem. We have a moral obligation to protect the planet and environment for all living things, and a responsibility to take any actions necessary to leave our planet healthy for future generations. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation and learned a little bit about climate change, and I thank you for listening.